Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we have Floyd with us from SQL Perform, and he's going to be covering NAV data archiving and compression. And we just ask that if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to type them into the questions box, and we will get them called out toward the end of the webinar. And we do record all of our webinars, so this will be available for you to review again or share with anyone who may be interested later this week on our website at Innovia.com. So now I'll turn it over to Floyd, and he'll go ahead and start the presentation.
Great, thanks, Angie. All right, welcome everybody. So we are going to talk for the next 45 minutes or so about NAV data archiving and compression and some of the tools and services that we bring to the table in order to do some of this work. Prior to going into the topic, let's just talk a little bit about SQL Perform. This particular video is the second of a series that we've done with Innovia. The first one we did last week, which covered off performance tools and performance tuning. So if you wish to understand those tools and services a little bit more, I urge you to look up that video series. Let's talk a little bit about SQL Perform, the organization, before we talk about the tools. And I apologize to anybody who might have attended last week, and this might be a bit of a repeat, but just so that all the new people attending can get a little bit better sense of who we are. So SQL Perform was originated by a gentleman by the name of Hinek Mulbacher. Hinek was a developer for Navision back in the day when it was actually owned by the Danish company. And he started working with Dynamics NAV in 1993. So it's been 25 years. And in approximately 1998 or so, when Navision AS, the original company, realized that likely Microsoft might be interested in acquiring the product and making it part of the Microsoft suite of products, Navision decided to add SQL Server as one of the database options. Prior to that, as some of you may know, NAV only had a proprietary database engine. And in the late 90s, SQL Server was added in order so that the product would support a platform that Microsoft promoted, and therefore also made the product more likely to be acquired. So, as we all know, in the early 2000s, NAV did actually get acquired by Microsoft and became part of the Dynamics suite of products. Now, since that time, Hinek has always been involved inside Navision and then Microsoft when they acquired the product as one of the key developers based out of the London office. And he's always been involved with the product NAV and SQL Server. And in fact, he was one of the internal guys who was used in order to help do some of the transitioning from the proprietary database engine to SQL Server. And in 2003, he decided to take a lot of his methodologies and tools and started up SQL Perform. So this is the nature of the company. So the company got started in 2003. And since that time, we've branched out into a number of different locations. The UK, where Hinek is based out of Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and we represent the North American branch. And in all these different areas, we have representation in some of the largest NAV customer market shares in the world. And in our role in SQL Perform, we do all sorts of things around tool sets, services, and focusing on performance and better tool sets so that you can implement NAV and use it better. We also provide consulting to Microsoft itself. So through several product design scenarios, we've actually been involved with the development division out of Copenhagen and actually had input in different parts of NAV and SQL Server performance for various version releases. So quite heavily involved with Microsoft and the product development itself as well. As we talk a little bit about SQL Perform in some of our clients, these are some of the European clients that we have. There are some North American ones. There's quite a few on top of these as well, but just to give you a little bit of a glimpse here. Let's focus now on the topic for today, which is all about data and data volume and what do you do with it, and how can we manage large sets of data for NAV. So first off, let's talk a little bit about data itself. And this data lifecycle applies to all sorts of different systems, not just NAV, but pretty much any system. So in this case, we're talking about, first of all, creating the data. And then once the data is created, using it on a day-to-day basis. Once it's in production and it's being used, then linking back to it and referencing it for things like reports and lookups, etc. And then over time, having history built up around this data set, and you may want to retain this for all sorts of legal reasons or for fiscal reasons. And then in the end, perhaps, depending on the system, throw it away. Right? Now in NAV in general, you probably don't want to throw away data, but there might be scenarios where maybe it makes sense, right? It's no longer used and therefore it may want to be discarded. Now, typically you don't want to do that with transactional data, but perhaps with some master records or other things, perhaps. Even then, personally, you probably want to think twice about that, but we'll talk about some other possible scenarios as we move on. Angie, by the way, I think your microphone is on, if you don't mind muting. Thank you. All right. Now, what has typically happened with most NAV deployments for most customers and partners is the NAV deployment has been put together and implemented quite a while ago, and perhaps the server was also defined quite a while ago. And over time, just because of business growing and transactions increasing over time, the NAV SQL Server database itself grows to quite a large size. And it is possible that with a large number of records, this can cause the system to slow down, especially if maybe you have poor performing indexes, or you have processes that need to run through large volumes of data in order to find the right records. Therefore, having a large number of records might impact those scenarios. As well, a large number of records can also impact maintenance. So things like doing statistics rebuilds or index rebuilds can take longer, or backups and restores can also take longer because you have larger sets of data that perhaps could slow down the entire system. So what do we have that can help these scenarios? So I'd like to now introduce what we call the archive tools. And to understand the archive tools, there's a suite of tools. There's 3 tools. First of all, you need to understand some of the principles that we had in putting some of these together. So when we first started looking at how to approach archiving, and actually, before I go into these principles, I should back up a moment and make a statement here, so that's actually very clear to everybody here, whether you're a customer or a partner or some other individual. NAV does have archiving tools built into them. All right, so that I'm going to declare and make sure that everybody is aware of them, so that you don't feel like I'm ignoring those. Now, however, the tools that are built into Dynamics NAV for archiving and compression, there's a couple things with them. First of all is a long time ago when they were first released, there was actually quite a few problems with them. And personally, I used them long time ago, prior to my life with SQL Perform. I, like many other implementers, had discovered that these flaws caused a lot of problems, and I never went back to them. And I think this is true for a lot of implementers, that there's a lot of distrust in the tools and how they work. Now, having said that, likely Microsoft has probably fixed some of those problems. Maybe all of them, I don't know. I've never tried since using them a long time ago. But there's also other limitations to the tools, which we'll run into and talk about very shortly, which also make them not as useful. And one of the big ones that you'll find is around how the data is compressed, right? And as I said, we'll touch on that shortly. So back to the principles of what we used to create the tools. First off, we never delete the original data, all right? So all the original data is always referenceable and accessible. So the point is now from a reporting perspective, legal and fiscal perspective, the data is there. You can go back and access it. I'll explain in a moment how that works, right? The archiving tools out of the box in standard NAV delete data, right? So once you do the compression, it is a one-way compression, unless of course you've done a backup, and then you might have to restore from a backup. But you can't go backwards from an archiving process in base nav. Our tools will also work with any nav table. All right, this includes base nav, custom tables, also third-party ISV. This is not true out of the box. Right, out of the box, it only works for very specific tables, and therefore very limited in terms of what you can archive and compress. And quite often, in most environments that I've seen, is customers do have heavily customized databases, and they quite likely have large custom functional areas with a lot of history, and therefore it is very useful to be able to compress and archive data in these areas. These tools are all built in SQL Server as SQL stored procedures. Okay, so they're the actual SQL scripts. They're not written in CalCode, so they run very quickly. And because they run in SQL Server, there's full data consistency. So therefore, if there is an error during compression, the full process rolls back. In other words, compress fully, and if not, then roll back, don't compress at all. Right? And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later, about how we guarantee some of that consistency and how do we manage some of that process. We also have built into the tool undo functions. You can de-archive and you will be able to decompress. And I'll explain our definitions of those two terms momentarily. We can also manage dimensions, and not just dimensions global 1 and 2, which you might be familiar with. Every nav database has two primary dimensions that are used throughout the system. And base nav compression only works with global 1 and 2. We will work with all your dimensions and also any other additional criteria. And I'll explain that also in a moment. Linked tables, so things like header line tables. So if we're doing compression on a header table, line tables are also considered, so that therefore we have no orphan data. Any tables that are related, we ensure that those things are considered. Also, as part of how the function works, very similar to how base nav works. In any functional area, you'll have something called a register, which records basically an audit trail record inside nav of who posted what when, right? Think of, for example, the GL register inside nav. We also have our own registers inside nav that we will populate when you do a compression, so that you can also go back and see who compressed what when. And as I mentioned, all the data, because the original data is never deleted, you will have access to all that historical data and be able to report on it at any point in time. So let's now go and explore the actual tools themselves. There's 3 tools, right? Each one of these tools are sold on subscription basis. So there's an annual licensing fee. And with that, you will get a number of different sets of functionality. So let's go explore that a little bit. The first set of tools is called Perform Dataport. Now, a couple things. One is, actually, I just got word from our head office in Europe that we're likely going to be taking this tool and probably no longer offer it, just because built into nav now, there's different ways now to copy data. And by the way, just in case you're on an older version of NAV and you're continuing to use our tools, we still will offer it for older versions. Just to be clear, the name here, Perform Dataport, we actually do not use NAV Dataport objects, but we actually use SQL Server scripts, and therefore using those are quite fast. This tool set allows you to basically copy data from any existing NAV company, table, or combination of entities from one source to another company or database, and also include any table relationships as part of that copy. So it's very useful for when you're doing partial copies or full copies from one company or database to another company and or database, right? But as I mentioned, if you're moving into NAV, I believe 2016, 2017 and up, this is something that is part of some of the functionality, especially around things like rapid start implementation tools and other areas. Let's move into the more interesting tools though. The first one that is really interesting is called Perform Archive. This one also moves data, right? But what it's going to do is it's going to basically look at specifically probably documents, right? Historical documents. Think of sales invoices, purchase invoices, other kinds of documents, typically header and line relationships. And what this tool will do is take records from your production database and basically will copy them to a separate SQL Server database, which we call the archive database. So basically it will take, for example, posted sales, header and line, and move it over to an archive database, posted sales, header and line, and then basically deletes them from the live database. And therefore they're no longer in the live database, but they now live in the archive database, separate from production, right? And now, as part of that move, we can also include any relational tables and dimensions, all right? And now, I mentioned we also have a de-archive process. So that movement from live to archive, we refer to that as archiving. And now you can understand how we can also de-archive. We can just simply take the data that's now in the archive database and move it back into production as necessary. So that works quite nicely. And as I said, this tool set typically focuses on documents, posted documents, or very similar structures where there's usually some sort of table and perhaps associated line tables. The third tool set, very similar to the Perform Archive tools. This is the Perform Compression tools. And they too also move data from live to the archive database. But in this particular case, the focus is typically on ledger tables, right? So if you understand NAV and have used it in the past or up to this point, ledger tables contain historical transactions, right? So it's all the records that represent all the things that have happened. Think GL entry, customer ledger entries, perhaps even inventory ledger entries, all right? All sorts of different entries. And what it does is it will take the records from live, again, move them to the archive database, it deletes them out of live, but then also creates compressed entries, essentially pivot records, if you want to think of it that way. We take all of the raw data and we basically create compressed entries and we write them back into the ledger entries to basically substitute for all the detailed records. We create summarized records. And what's interesting is the summarized records, we can pivot them, compress them in any way that you define. In other words, unlike the compression tools that exist in base NAV, which typically compress based on posting date, global 1, global 2, and maybe there might be a few others. It's very predefined and constrained in terms of how you can work out of the box. Using our tool set, you can actually define however you want to compress by. So for example, let's say we are talking GL entry, and in this case, let's say you want to compress everything prior to the year 2015, and perhaps you have 10 years of history. And because you have reports that run off the GL entry, and perhaps you have a custom field in your GL entry, perhaps you are recording, I don't know, location code, or maybe there's one other field that you use that you've created that's very unique. And these fields are actually used in reports for historical analysis. You may choose to actually compress by those criteria, not only date period, and of course GL account number, but also these additional criteria, so that your reports will stay consistent, right? As you're analyzing data. If you were to use the tools out of the box, those values actually get compressed out, and they are not retained in the standard compression entries. Our tools will give you any combination of compression that you want to define. All right, so as part of this compression, we can also consider dimensions, link tables, and other values. And as I mentioned, now that you see that we can compress records by taking the data, original record set, and copying them over to archive and creating compression entries, we can also decompress. Now you might be wondering, well, how does that work? How can you guarantee that there is this ability to do that, and how do we know that that doesn't interfere with my actual live production data? Let's, for example, again talk about GL entry. Well, it's actually very interesting how we do it. If you think about GL entry, and maybe you might be a little bit technical, so I'm going to talk a little technically here, but in GL entry, there's the primary key field, which is an entry number. And if you're familiar with it, you'll notice that the first entry starts with number 1. It's just a sequential number that keeps increasing, right? So therefore, let's just say you have been running NAV for 10 years, and you did want to archive up to, let's say, the year 2015. So everything forward from the year 2016, let's say, is in original detail, but everything prior to that is compressed records only. So how do we do that? Well, let's just pretend that those records up to the end of 2015 are the records number 1 through 1,000,000, let's just say. All right. What our tool does is it actually takes those records 1 through 1,000,000. It will copy them to the archive database 1 through 1,000,000. Go back to the production database, delete the records 1 through 1,000,000. Okay. But then compress those records. So now instead of 1,000,000 records, maybe we'll replace it with a few thousand records. And what we do is the entry number, if you're familiar with it, from a technical perspective, that entry number is an integer. And if you know anything about NAV and technically how it works, the integer values that are allowed are actually -2 billion to +2 billion. So the fact that standard NAV uses numbers 1 forward is fine, but in fact, the system allows negative numbers. So what we do is for our compressed records is we actually start writing from -2 billion forward. So our compressed records live in the negative range, and therefore they do not interfere with the production range, right? But if you think about it from a flow field perspective or a summing perspective, all those records are there and they add up properly. And if for some reason you want to decompress, by picking one of those compressed record entries, because of our registers, we know that that one compressed record is comprised of certain detail records, which now live in the archive database. If you wanted to decompress a compressed GL entry, it would be a simple case of running the process. It would delete that one compressed record out of the -2 billion range, and from the archive database, retrieve the original records in whatever number range they were and put them back into production, because those numbers were deleted when we moved everything to archive. So it's very easy to move them right back to where they were originally. So this is how the compression and decompression works. And it's actually quite neat if you think about it. And if you understand a little bit technically how that works, you should be able to understand how this now maintains consistency. One of the things that we also include as part of the perform compression, this is an additional granule, an additional component, also at an additional fee, is the ability to actually look at your item ledger entries and look at anything that is still open but could be closed. So what am I talking about? Let me back up another step. Our compression tool will only ever look at closed entries in a ledger. In other words, think of GL entry, think of customer ledger entries, vendor ledger entries, even item ledger entries. Our tools will only work on closed entries. All right, so if there's open entries, meaning that they're not complete and they're not fully applied or whatever the case may be, we will not touch them. We will only compress things that are closed. Okay, so having said that, item ledger entry is a very special case in the sense that in a properly maintained environment, item ledger entries should be closed based on all the different entries being matched up properly and processed properly. The reality is that we find when we're doing compressions for our clients is quite often the item ledgers for a lot of clients remain open just simply because as part of maintenance processes and standard operating processes, clients haven't properly closed all their item ledger entries when they should have. So our compression tools, as I mentioned, run on closed entries. So what we find typically is that quite often in item ledger entry, we don't gain as much compression as we would like, only because the item ledger entries have not been closed. All right, so our tool, Calculate Open Stock Entries, basically looks at item ledger entry and determines if there are a number of item ledger entries that should be closed, and therefore provides the client the ability to go in and actually close those entries and increase the amount of compression that's possible, especially around inventory, right? So that's the tool sets. All right, let's talk a little bit about how do the tools actually work. So a couple things. One is in most scenarios that we have, we find that clients have a live database, of course, with a lot of data. And typically what they will do is they will create a secondary archive database. And as I mentioned, what will happen is they will implement the tools. And what will happen is they'll run the tools for the first time. They will archive and compress the live data and essentially move that data over to the archive database, as well as compressing and trimming the entries out of the live database, right? And then typically what happens is then at the end of the first year is quite often the clients will rerun our tool set on the same database, and once again, move any additional data from the live database to the archive database. And likewise, continuing on to year 2 as well, and doing the same thing year after year, right? Now, having said this, how does this work? Well, it works quite well, but there is one constraint. And the constraint is that the table structure that is over on the live database must be the same as the table structure over on the archive database. So what does that mean? Well, if you've introduced changes in terms of the field structure and additional tables in the live database, the only thing that you must do is ensure that the archive database also has the same table structure. And the tool set, you may need to adjust it slightly in order to accommodate any additional fields or any types of compression. And we'll talk about the tools in a moment. The tools, basically the way they're set up, everything is set up through configuration. All right, and I'll explain how that all works in a moment. But in any case, the whole idea is that table structure on live and archive must be the same. So this is one very popular approach in terms of how to archive data. Basically one live database, one archive database, and running the tools year after year on a periodic basis. Another way to do this is you can also take our tools and archive the live data, but what you can do is move it into an archive data set for go live the first time you run it. And then again, at the end of year one, an option is to actually archive it into a separate archive database. So perhaps you want to store your data year by year, right? And some of our clients do it this way, that perhaps because of data governance and retention rules, where perhaps they do want to drop their data sets, let's say after 7 or 10 years, and therefore by doing it this way, you can see it's very easy just to drop a data set after a period of time. To be honest, this is not as popular as the first method, but we do have some clients who use this approach in order to manage their data. So this is also possible, is what we're pointing out. All right. Okay. So let's talk now about, okay, great. The tools sound great. And the outcome sounds great. And by the way, I should back up a moment, and I should give some high-level testimonials here. When we first started implementing these tools in North America, they had already been tested for several years in Europe. And in North America, this would have probably been about 4 or 5 years ago when we first brought the archiving tools out. Our very first client that we implemented the archiving and compression tools on was a very large North American retailer. And in their case, they had a 1.3 terabyte database, and we helped them bring them down to 800 gigs. Right? So basically trim down that database by 500 gigs, and all while maintaining data consistency from a reporting perspective. Think of all the flow fields on GL account balances, things like customer balances, all those historical lookups, etc. All those things all worked. So everything worked quite well. So since that time, actually, we've done quite a few customers in North America. All of them very successful, and all of them very, very happy in terms of being able to size down their databases. So let me talk a little bit about now how we approach the archiving projects. So what we do is we essentially treat archiving and compression as 3 sub-projects. As you can see up in the gray up at the top, what we call an assessment project, a configuration project, and a deployment project. So the assessment project is a fixed price project on top of, well, actually there's no tools to be bought at this point. The assessment project is basically a scenario where we're given access to likely a copy of your production database. And we basically have a series of tools that allow us to analyze that database and come up with essentially an Excel spreadsheet, which will summarize all of the different tables in the current production database, NAV production database, and what our possible compression percentages might be. And therefore, this gives you, the client, the ability to determine, is this a good idea or not? The assessment project is a fixed price project. It's a fairly low cost project. We go in and we run all these, and we do all the work in blue, and the red is your steps as a client. So basically you would review that table sizing spreadsheet, have a discussion with us in terms of what's possible, what's not possible, and what savings could you get by running a compression and archiving project on your production database, and give us a go, no-go decision. Right? And at that point, we move forward. And interestingly enough, we've never had anybody who after looking at the table sizing project said, no, this doesn't make sense. Actually, I think everybody who's ever done it has actually moved forward to the next step, which is to do a configuration project. So the configuration project, unlike the assessment project, is time and material. And in this particular case, what we do is in a copy of the production database, we will install a number of tools, and we will use the output from the assessment project, that Excel spreadsheet, which guides us towards which tables should we focus on for compression. And we will go in and basically configure all of the scripts to use the tables that were defined, and also set up all the parameters necessary in order for a compression and archiving to work in that test database. Also, there might be some additional discoveries and things that we might find out, or we might have additional questions about how you may want to archive and compress, and we would configure the tools to work accordingly. Once we have everything done, we would run tools, which would then create a test database. And at that point, we would hand over testing to you, the client, to verify that actually the compression worked, reports can be run on that compression database, and everything is still in a consistent format. If everything is good, then out of that step, you would give us a go, no-go decision. And that could lead to the third project, which is actually to take all this information and now apply it to production. Now, what's interesting about the deployment project is, depending on the client and the partner involved, sometimes what will happen is we'll be engaged as SQL Perform to help do the entire deployment, or the other extreme is the client feels very comfortable after getting through the configuration project and seeing how the tools work and the steps involved, that sometimes the client themselves might say, you know what, we'll do all that work, we'll apply it to production. It seems very straightforward and not a problem. And therefore, the deployment project, the engagement required from us, depends on the decisions made in the configuration project. And when it comes to deployment, we've done everything from we are fully hands-on to we're fully hands-off, and any step in between, including providing training or guidance, could also be part of how we approach the deployment project with your particular scenario. So this is a high-level view of the project approach. Let's talk a little bit about each one of these three projects in a little bit more detail in terms of what do we do within each one of those. So that assessment project, the way it works is, again, you have a production database. You would back it up and restore it into a test database. You would provide us access to that test database, and from that, we would generate an assessment report, which basically talks about the possibilities of compression and how much could you gain in moving forward. The configuration project looks a lot more complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. So let me explain this so that it makes more sense. I know it looks scary, but it's actually, as I said, not that hard. So the configuration project, the way it works is, again, we start with your production database, and you would, as a client, back it up and provide us with 3 copies of that production. One that we call UAT copy, one called UAT live, and one called UAT archive. All right, so it's actually 3 copies of production currently is what you see in that configure phase. Let's follow the UAT archiving path down at the bottom. So what happens now is the UAT archiving database, which has been restored from production, the next step is we delete all of the data out of UAT archive. So the only thing that's left is basically the setups, the configuration, the shell of the NAV database, right? There's no data in it. It's just the tables and the database configuration. So this is why you'll see in there it says metadata shell. All right. Let's jump back up to the middle row, UAT live. This is the database where we are going to take that assessment report. We're going to take our tools, which are templates, SQL stored procedures, and basically it's waiting for a bunch of configuration parameters to be set up. We would take the data from the assessment report and we would configure that set of templates. We would also have potentially a bunch of questions and maybe further recommendations of what you can do in terms of getting more compression out of the system. And we would set up these templates and we would run them. When we run the templates, this is when we take that UAT live and create now a UAT live that now has trimmed and compressed data. All right, so it's the slimmed down version of UAT live. And at the same time, it takes the data from UAT live and moves it into UAT archive, right? Remember that we originally just had a shell, and now we're going to move the data into it because it now already has the table structures and everything already. Okay, so now that we've done that step, this is when we move to test phase. And honestly, configure phase usually does not take us very long. We find test phase is what takes the longest, where the client needs to go through and validate for themselves that everything works and that everything is consistent. So in that test phase, what you'll see is that UAT copy is a copy of production. It was a snapshot. So it's the full version of production. And now you should be able to look at UAT live and UAT archive and compare it to UAT copy as the benchmark and validate that everything came across as you would expect it and everything works properly. Okay, so let's assume now you've done the test phase, everything looks good, and you're happy with it. What happens when we go to live? So in the deployment project, what we do is we take the production database and we back it up and restore it, and again, create an archive database, delete all the records out of that archive database. So now you're left with a shell, right? And guess what? The templates that we created over on the configuration project, we now take those and we just simply apply it to production. And now you can see it just simply takes the production data and now trims and compresses that production data and populates that archive database, right? So all that should be applied and run fairly smoothly. So let's quickly recap here. Back to the NAV data lifecycle. So we talked about creating the data, and then you use that data in an operational scenario for day-to-day transactions. You then could also use some of that data for reference. And again, for things like ledger entries, you can have compressed records in that live database, and you can have archival data sitting in the archive database. Okay, and then for archival data, again, you could choose to trim it out of the production database, so it's completely removed, but it lives in the archive database, right? So again, it's all there. And you could choose to discard, which is, again, using the tools, trim them out of the live database, and they would live over in the archive database. By the way, one of the things I sort of just skimmed a little bit over, and that was the topic of reporting. But if you think about it, a couple things. One is the archive database is exactly the same structure as the production database. So what some of our clients do is they make that archive database read-only, and then you can actually take your NAV client and point it to the archive database, and you can actually look at it over on that side if you like. So that's one way you could do it. The other thing that you could do is if you use third-party reporting tools, is you can join your live and your archive database and report off the two databases and really have the full sum of your original record sets. So that's also very doable, and we have a lot of clients who work that way. And there's a number of other possible approaches. But just to show you that reporting still works, and it's just a slightly different approach in terms of where you have to get your data from. But this way, things are isolated a little bit better and compartmentalized so that they live in different places better. All right, at this point, this takes me to the end of my slide deck. So I guess, Angie, at this point, we can open up for questions. Are there any questions?
Not at this time, Floyd, but if anyone does have any, feel free to type them in and we'll get those answered for you.
All right, perfect. I'll just give everybody a moment just in case people are thinking about those questions. In the meantime, what I'll do is I'll just move to my next deck. In case you need to reach out to us, obviously through Innovia is one way, but also if you need to reach us directly, this is our contact information as well. Angie, any questions pop up?
No.
Okay, no problem. In that case, I'll hand the presentation over to you.
All right. Well, we thank everyone for attending, and we hope you got a lot of informative information out of the topic that Floyd discussed. And thank you, Floyd, for the presentation. That was very, very good and a lot of information to take away from that.
Perfect.
And
Thank you very much.
And we just want to let everyone know that, like I said at the beginning, this has been recorded, so it will be available on our website later in the week for you to review again or to share with anyone who may be interested. And looks like we got a question.
Perfect.
One of the attendees said thank you. It was very clear. The
Awesome.
information was
Okay.
very clear, so thank you.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, please go to our website for any future events that you may want to sign up for. We do have another one coming up this week. We have Quick Learn that will be delivering a complete e-learning platform inside Microsoft Dynamics in minutes. They will be presenting tomorrow. So if you're interested in that webinar, please register. And then we have Generics Group presenting on food traceability, understanding your current capabilities, next Tuesday on the 25th. So if you're interested in any of our events or future events, please don't hesitate to get on there and register. And we will be at Directions in San Diego at the beginning of October. And we will also be at Summit Phoenix in booth 529 this year, October 15th through the 18th. So we hope to see you there. Stop by, and we would love to meet any of your employees that are attending and see what we can do to collaborate any conversations with you. All right, well, thank you again, everyone, for attending. We will look forward to seeing you on one of our future webinars, and have a great day.